afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the country. Thanks so much for joining us for our behind the scenes of the score. I'm your host, Vinay Croft. I'm the Field Marketing Manager of the Americas region. And today we're offering you an in-depth discussion about the GMAT score. On the road, I get questions all the time. How's the GMAT used in the decision process? How's the score tabulated? So we're going to really have a deep dive into what's the score comprised of, how's it formulated, and how's it used to make admissions decisions. Today, well, before we jump into who we have on board, I want to give you a few housekeeping notes. So if you have questions, you definitely want all your questions answered. Pop the questions into the comments. At the end of the session, we're going to go through all the questions, or as many questions as we can get to within our allotted time, and answer all of your questions today. So please, please, please ask questions, post them in the comment section, and we'll get to them then. Also, want to give you the opportunity to participate in our monthly survey. If you go to mba.com/surveys, we have 2 questions we ask every month. We're just trying to get information from you all. You get an opportunity to earn a $50 GMAT exam voucher. So please do that if you're interested. Joining us today, we have one of my colleagues. She's a senior psychometrician, Eileen Talento Miller, and she is going to walk us through information about the test from the test maker's perspective. So you'll get insight on how the scores are formulated, what's all included, and then we're also going to hear from the admissions side of the house as well. And joining us today, we have Amanda Carlson. She is the Dean of Admissions for Columbia Business School. And we also have J.R. McGrath joining us. He is the Admissions Director at Southern Methodist University, Cox School of Business. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me participate.
Awesome. Well, we're going to jump right into it, make sure we have enough time to get to all the questions, get through all of our information. So I'm going to start with you, Eileen, as a test maker. Help us to understand how important the GMAT is. How is this total score calculated?
Well, Fanny, so some of the background about the GMAT exam, the GMAT's been in use since 1954. And with that original test, it had the verbal section, the quantitative section, and both of those sections added together formed the basis for the total score. Now, I say both of those added together. It wasn't like one was 400 points, the other one was 400 points. Each of them was scaled separately, and then from the background performance or whatever on each of the sections, those numbers were added together, and then they were put on what at that time was the common scale from 200 to 800. And so throughout the years, we've made a number of changes to the GMAT exam, specifically, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but the making the sections adaptive, and that has changed the way that the scores have been calculated. But we wanted to keep the same logic for the total score, and that is that the total score is going to be based on both the verbal and the quantitative components. So it is, at its essence, it is the verbal plus the quantitative, and then that number is then scaled onto the same 200 to 800 scale that's been in use since 1954. One of the things that I'm often asked is why can you have two different, or how can two people have the same set of verbal and quantitative scores, for instance, and have different total scores? Well, the reason for that is because, again, now that we have more advancements in the way that test scores are calculated and so forth, there's actually a continuous scale. So there's actually decimal values associated with their test score. So let's say that somebody has a verbal score of 40. Well, if you think about it, that score could actually be like a 39.51, and somebody else with the same 40 could have a 40.49. So if you have that same score on both sections, then the sum for one person would be about 79, and for the other person, it'd be about 81. So it makes sense that those two people would actually have two different total scores. But they are really close together. They will be really close together. And so what we recommend is that when scores are close together, that you use other factors in admissions.
Okay. Thank you. So that helps us understand the total score, and everyone knows they look at that range before applying to schools. how about the individual score sections? How are those sections scored?
This is, as you know, there are 4 sections on the GMAT, and each, and basically there are 3 different ways that the sections are scored. The verbal and quantitative sections are adaptive sections. I'm not going to talk about the logic behind computer adaptive testing, but basically what that means is that everybody's going to get a different set of questions. So it really wouldn't be fair to just say, everybody that get 30 questions correct gets the same score, because one person gets 30 difficult questions correct and another person gets 30 easy questions correct. So the logic behind the adaptive test takes 3 things into consideration. First, it's the questions you get and the difficulty of those questions. Second, whether or not you get them right or wrong. Each of the specific questions. Did you get that question right? Did you get that question right? And then the last part of it is the how many questions you finished. If you don't finish the section, we can't give you any credit for the questions that you didn't finish. So we have to make some sort of adjustment, but we don't know. We also don't know what questions you would have gotten because you didn't respond to them. So the adjustment has to do with how much of the test you finished. And so once we figure out what your score would have been, then that's adjusted by the number of questions that you finished versus the number of questions in the section. So if you finish 90% of the section, you'll get 90% of your score, for instance. Now, the integrated reasoning section is not an adaptive section. Everybody gets 12 questions, but not everybody gets the same 12 questions. One thing that's important to know about the integrated reasoning section is that a lot of the questions have multiple answers, multiple things that you have to answer. And you have to get all of the things on a single question correct in order for that question to be counted correct. Now, the reason for that is because it's called integrated reasoning. So if you can't put all of the pieces together in order to get all of the parts of the question correct, then you haven't integrated the information effectively. And so that's the justification behind you have to get all of the pieces correct. So counted correct if you don't get to a question. So anything that you don't finish is counted as wrong. Now, the thing about it is, everybody gets 12 questions, but again, not everybody gets the same 12 questions. So there is an adjustment after the fact based on the set of questions that you get. Again, a little bit of an adjustment for the difficulty of the set of questions that you get. The last section, and the one that's most unlike the others, if you will, would be the analytical writing section where you have the essay. The essay is scored holistically. That means that the raters would read through the whole essay before deciding on a single score. Now, what this means is that there are no points taken off for spelling or grammar mistakes. What they're looking for is your reasoning process and your ability to communicate that reasoning process in writing. Now, that's not to say that spelling doesn't count at all. 1 or 2 spelling mistakes probably wouldn't interfere with your ability to communicate, but if the essay is rife with mistakes, then you can see how that would, in fact, interfere with your ability to get across to communicate your thoughts in writing. And so it's not that spelling doesn't count, but it's not, we're going to count off for each specific mistake that you make. The person looks at the whole thing together and says, well, because this person wasn't able to communicate, or because, their thoughts weren't that clear, or something like that. Those are the things that go into account with the analytical writing score.
Okay, thank you. I want to piggyback or dovetail back on the comment you made about computer adaptive testing. If you are computer adaptive testing, tests are very different from standardized tests. And we talk about that a bit in our understanding and preparing for the GMAT exam session. So if that's something you aren't familiar with and you want to have a bit more insight about how computer adaptive testing works as it relates to the GMAT exam, definitely join us for that session. We'll have one taking place in April during our GMAT prep camp. So I just wanted to throw that in there in the event that you're like, okay, computer adaptive testing is the first time hearing about that. We can kind of take you back and give you an understanding of that next month. So back to you, Eileen. Question though. So we get questions about the scores, but then candidates are also curious about percentiles. So how are the percentiles determined?
The percentiles are based on the people who got a score that was lower than yours. So Let's take a person. I looked this up today so that I could talk about it. The verbal score, if you had a verbal score of 40, that would put you at the 91st percentile. That means within the past 3 years, 91% of the people who took the GMAT exam got a verbal score of 39 or lower. And that means 9% got either the same score that you did or a higher score than that. So the percentiles are based on a rolling 3-year period. The reason we use 3 years is because that represents the people who are currently potentially applying for business schools today. If you think about it, the GMAT score is valid for 5 years. You can use it for 5 years, but most people apply within 2 years of taking the GMAT exam. So that puts us within that 3-year window. We change it every year so that it is the most recent people that have been that are applying to business school. What that means is that if you took the test a while ago, then your percentiles on your score report might actually be different than the current percentiles in use today. And again, it's the current percentiles that reflect the people that you're currently competing against, but it also, there's actually very little change in those numbers. They don't jump about a lot, and so the percentile is going to be pretty close. However, because it is the scores that are constant across time and not the percentiles, then we recommend that the scores be used and not the percentiles. The percentiles are a convenient benchmark, but it's the score that's important.
Okay. This is a question we get often as well. We talk about it during the candidate session. What's more important, getting a good GMAT score? To getting a good GMAT score, is it about being accurate and getting all the questions right, or about finishing the exam? Like, is one more important than the other?
Now, I find this really funny because I have college-age kids, and I was going to an information session with admissions professionals, just like the ones we have here. And the question that a lot of the parents had was, is it more important to take hard classes or to get good grades? And of course, the answer is, it's important to get good grades in hard classes. And so my answer here is pretty much the same. It's important to be accurate and to finish the test. So a different way to frame this question would probably be, should you spend more time on questions to try and get them right if you're going to risk not being able to finish? So it's that trade-off between, do I spend more time because I think I can get the questions right, or do I, but that means I might not finish, and what's the score difference going to be? I talked about the way each of the scores are calculated, and it's clear that there's no set way, that there's no fixed number of points that you're going to get taken off for one question, 2 questions, et cetera, because it depends on what those questions are, specifically in the adaptive section. I'm going to give you 2 perspectives on this question, from the way that I think and the way that I feel. And so from the thinking perspective, I'm going to talk about the research, some of the research that we've done in order to address this question. And both of those sets of research, and they're actually available on our website, have to do with guessing, the impact of guessing, either at the end of the test or throughout the test. So the research on the impact, the first study that I did had to do with, if you're reaching the end of the test, should you guess through or should you just leave the questions blank? So this kind of addresses that question of, how many points would be taken off if you just left it blank. The research basically said there's a benefit to guessing, just like we knew with any regular test. Usually it's probably better to guess if you can. There's a few differences here and there, but generally speaking, you kind of want to finish the test. However, there are some cases in which it's probably better to finish the problem that you're working on with thought rather than leaving the number of questions blank. And then again, it depends on how many questions are left in the test. So then back to the other study. The other study was looking at guessing throughout different positions of the test. So for instance, if you guessed the first 5 questions and got them all right, is that different than guessing 5 questions in the middle that you got all right, or 5 questions at the end that you got all right? And what it turns out is that there is no difference. If you get a string of 5 questions correct, and this was simulated based on what we knew that person's score to be, how they would answer the questions. We forced some of the questions to correct, and then they answered, and then we simulated their responses to the rest of the test. By and large, the benefit to getting those sets of questions correct really didn't change much from the beginning to the middle to the end. There were some slight differences depending on what your ability level was, what your score would happen to be, as you would probably expect. Somebody who normally would have gotten a low score that suddenly gets a string of 5 questions forced correct gets much more benefit. So, so there are some considerations throughout the paper that you'll see in there. So basically, spending more time, the message is that spending more time at the beginning does not necessarily translate into a better score later. So then I'm going to circle back to my second perspective, and I said that was from how I feel about it. And this is from a logical perspective. It's a risk versus reward scenario. Do you risk spending more time at the beginning of the test to get that question correct when you risk not being able to finish the test? And the way I see it is spending more time on a question does not guarantee that you will get that question correct. There are some questions that you can look at, and maybe some questions in the quant section where you think, well, let me work that out a different way and make sure that I have the answer correct. And then you know how much time that's going to take and so forth. But there are other questions, and I know for me personally, some of the questions in the verbal section I can stare at for hours and not be sure of what the answer is. And so from a feeling perspective, why would I risk that, that I'm going to run out of time and know that there's going to be something wrong at the end when I could just skip this, guess, give my best guess. Maybe I've got it down to 3 options and give my best guess and move on. The thing about it is, with the adaptive scenario, especially at the beginning, if you do make a mistake, if you guess wrong, then presumably the questions that you get later on will get you back to where you were. So the risk for me personally, and this is from a feeling perspective, the risk isn't worth it. The best scenario is to actually answer all the questions that you can with thought. And if you get to a guessing situation, you need to get it down to as many options, or as few options, I should say, as possible. Guess and then move on, because if you're having trouble with that one, you're going to have trouble with more later. And if you spend all of your extra time, if you will, on those first couple questions, you don't have any extra time for the questions that come on down the line. So that's my advice, is to guess when you have to and make sure you're keeping track of your time.
Absolutely. Finishing off with what I was going to say. This sounds like basic practice. That will help you. So it's going to be important to have an understanding about how long it's taking you on the different sections, on the different question types, and build that into your prep strategy so that you have an understanding of, hey, I'm typically averaging about 2.5 minutes in critical reasoning questions. And so you see yourself, what's your point that you guess and move on? Is it when you get to 2 minutes and 37 seconds? So think about this and incorporate it into your prep strategy. It can only help. Thank you, Eileen. I'm going to shift over now to the admissions perspective to get your insights on the GMAT exam, how you factor that into your score. So I'm looking at you, Amanda. You're on my screen right now. Okay. Tell me how important the GMAT is in the admissions process.
Okay. Well, it's important. So that's the cut to the chase. It's absolutely an important part of the process. And at Columbia, obviously, we really view the GMAT as a measure of how people are really going to perform in the core curriculum. And we have done studies, validity studies with GMAT, based off of GMAT scores that candidates and our students submitted as part of their application process, and then go back each semester to take a look at how they performed in the core curriculum. And we have an incredibly strong correlation between performance in the classroom and the GMAT scores that people are accepted with. And so therefore, absolutely, it's a critical part of our application review.
What about you, JR?
I mean, I would absolutely agree. It is a core component of the application for most, if not all, business schools. Now, for us, there are a few other academic things that we look at to also help gauge if someone can be competitive in the classroom, successful in the classroom, and some of that is their past academics. So if someone maybe did not do as well in past academics, it's hard to go back and change that, but you could put more time and effort into your entrance exam to show that you really do have those skills, but maybe you weren't able to showcase that in a previous situation. So that's just to kind of add on to what Amanda said there.
Yeah.
Sure. And so Amanda spoke to using the validity studies that they have with her school. What information or insights does the score provide to you about the candidate?
So like you said, there are a few different components of the exam. A lot of business or graduate business education is quantitative based. There's going to be some of those core classes that, whether you're a quantitative person or not, you're going to need to have those skills. And even if it doesn't correlate to your career goals, it is a good indicator if people are going to be able to handle that type of coursework, and vice versa. We have a lot of people coming in that maybe are quant heavy in their previous academics or their career field, and communication is a key part to going on in your career after. Most of those corporations are looking for people to lead, and looking at the verbal section, looking at the writing section, the integrated reasoning will give us also an insight into, even though someone can do that quantitative part very easily, how are they going to perform in those communication type scenarios that are going to be a requisite for their future work.
Okay. Amanda, is there an ideal total GMAT score that business schools in general desire, or your university desire? And does the score vary depending on the program type?
Yeah, so we get this question a lot, as you might well imagine. And no, there's no ideal or perfect score. This is why when you look at any of the stats of the various business programs to which candidates will be applying, you'll see a big range in terms of who's been admitted into the program. And generally what we encourage people to do, at least at, pardon me, at Columbia, is to look at kind of a middle 80% range of where last year's incoming class fell. This, again, the GMAT is really the one piece of information that is standard across 95% probably of our applicant pool. So again, there's no target that we necessarily have. It's one piece of information about each individual candidate. It's an important piece of information, but it is one piece of information. And in terms of the second part of your question, if I heard you correctly, is does the score matter? Does the type of score, the range of score matter depending on the programs to which people are applying, the type of program, whether it's full-time, part-time, EMBA? Did I get that correct?
Yes.
The second part. So no, look, the answer is, again, is going to be, it depends, because that's the answer a lot of times in business school, by the way, is it depends. So when you're looking at folks who are applying for an executive MBA, for example, they may have 25 years of work experience. So they aren't necessarily in that sharp test taking mode that somebody who may still be in undergraduate and still be in college may have. And so absolutely, their scores may not be, the average may not be a 715, a 720, whatever the average score may be for a full-time program. But again, it doesn't mean it's not as equally important. One thing to point out, and I'm not sure if it's really appropriate for this particular audience, but if there is someone who's looking at an executive MBA program, Columbia partnered with GMAT to put together the executive assessment, which is a variation of the GMAT, but for people who are applying for the executive MBA program. And like Eileen had been talking about, there are a variety of components and scoring mechanisms for the GMAT. Well, the executive assessment is it's much more focused on the integrated reasoning aspect of the executive assessment than the GMAT is. And so your scores are much more contingent upon how one does in the integrated reasoning. It's adaptive by section and not by question as well. And the reason that Columbia had worked with some other schools and approached GMAT about this is when we had done our own validity studies for our EMBA population and looked at the GMAT scores and how people were faring in the core curriculum, we found, again, a stronger correlation with the integrated reasoning part of the GMAT than we were with either the quantitative or verbal sections. And so that's why we really look to GMAT as the expert to help us come up with a test that we could utilize that would help us for the executive MBA population. So just so people are aware that there is that option for the GMAT for the executive MBA, but there's also an option for the executive assessment.
JR, I have a feeling that your answer is going to be similar and that you don't have an ideal score or that it depends, but what are your thoughts?
And I completely agree with Amanda. The one thing that I would add is when you narrow down your list of schools that you're looking to apply to, do that little bit of extra research, look at those 80 percentile ranges. But there are going to be some program formats that offer a wide range of scholarships. There's going to be some that maybe don't offer scholarships. So if you want to be competitive, not just for admission, but for some of those other benefits that programs can offer, like scholarship, you may want to put extra research into not just being in the bottom range and assuming that that's going to give you an opportunity to get some of the highest awards. So everyone in admissions is usually a very personable person. They like to talk to people. Don't hesitate to reach out and maybe ask some questions, but make sure you do your research first. If it's, all that information is typically available on the website. So make sure if you're looking for something, it's not always just about a yes or no for admission. It could be about having a more competitive score to be able to get some other benefits from the programs.
That's a really good point.
Are percentiles important in your decision-making process?
We look at the raw scores at Columbia. I'll speak for myself too. Raw scores, percentile, not so much.
Okay. What about you, JR?
I mean, agreed. We always look at the raw score first. When you look at that 80% range or those that maybe fall without those ranges, every once in a while you would look at that to see, how they're faring against other parts of the population, maybe in a specific content area, if you feel like maybe that's a weakness or maybe even a strength in their application. So it's usually something that we look at secondary, because when you look at as many scores as all the admissions staff does, you pretty much know where the percentile is going to fall anyways, but getting that final clarification could sometimes be helpful. But as Amanda said, the raw score is typically where we look first. Okay.
And do you value a certain section of the exam more than others?
I would, for the most part, no, but I would say that, like, one of my previous answers was about most of the core curriculum is going to be in nature. So that is a section that we look at. If someone has done poorly in that section, we do have more concern that they may not be able to be as successful in the classroom with those types of classes. So while we don't have a favorite part, that would be a section that we definitely keep a strong eye on, just to make sure that we're not bringing in someone that could not be successful in that type of coursework.
Gotcha. So it sounds like while you do look at the total score, you also look at those individual scores and consider that as you're making your decision. Okay. What about you, Amanda?
So actually, going back, the answer is it depends. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on the candidate's academic background, their professional background. And yes, again, at Columbia, we actually do look at the individual sections a little bit more closely, depending on what someone's academic background may or may not be. Further, we may look a little bit more closely at the integrated reasoning or the writing, depending on whether or not English is the native language of somebody who is applying to the program. And one of the things that I was very surprised when I took the IR myself, I found the vocabulary to be very difficult and challenging. And so just for myself, I've always kind of, that is stuck with me. And so again, when English isn't necessarily the native language of a candidate, I look a lot at the writing as well as the integrated reasoning, in addition, obviously, to the verbal part.
Okay. What about you, JR? I sometimes will meet candidates and they're like, well, yeah, I'm probably not going to really even study for the IR section because schools don't pay as much attention to that.
So we absolutely look at all sections, and the interesting part about that, when you look at all schools, we usually report those quantitative and, well, we report the total score. We don't report the individual sections. But for example, if someone has done really well on the regular part and they have a 1 or a 0 percentile or just very, very low scores in those other sections, you know that it brings up questions. You first go to the thought of, they just mailed it in, they didn't try. So that's a red flag for us that they may not be someone that is always going to finish everything that they start. So we do look at those, and as Amanda said, it's going to be those other factors of why we're going to look more closely at those sections. Like maybe it's the career change, maybe it's their background, but those are indicators for us of, this either really makes sense for that candidate. If it raises questions that we can't answer, in my opinion, that's something that you never want a admission committee to have. If there's a bunch of follow-up questions that no one in the committee can answer and wonder why, that usually could lead to more of a negative response rather than a positive response for a candidate. So I would put all my effort into all the different sections, and I know that there are some that are anxious mostly about those first two sections, that quantitative and verbal, and they want to get their highest total score possible. So sometimes that's why they'll tell us that's why I'm in the very low percentile here, because I was so worried about these other, I wanted to put all of my mental capacity onto those sections. Most programs are pretty rigorous. So if you tell me that you can't handle 4 sections of a test, then again, I mean, that just, it may not lead to a rejection, but it just leads to a concern from our part of, can you really handle what you're trying to achieve here?
Any other thoughts, Amanda, on that?
Nope, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Awesome. Well, no, that's great. We tell candidates all the time that it's a complete picture that the admissions teams are trying to gain, and so it really sounds like you're using all the information that you collect to gain insights about the candidates. So there isn't maybe a blanket approach to it, but perhaps there's something about this person's background or experience that might cause you to look more deeply into one section or the other to gain more insights on the candidates. So take it all seriously, people. Now let's face it, some people get low GMAT scores. How is that just an automatic no? Is that an indication that the person probably isn't right for business school if they've gotten a low score?
No, no. I mean, not necessarily. We can probably both provide you with examples of people who didn't have a high GMAT score when they applied, and they did extraordinarily well in the program. And likewise, we can also provide you with examples of people who didn't do so well on the GMAT and for whom things didn't turn out so well. So we have examples of both, but I think there are other distinguishing factors or characteristics that we would consider when someone is applying. I will tell you, one of my all-time favorite students, I met her at a prospective student event, and tears, crying, to be like, I have tried the GMAT 7 times, and the highest score I've gotten is a 490. First of all, I fell in love with this woman. She was just absolutely wonderful. And she's like, I'm going to try it the 8th time and we'll see how it goes. She got a 500 on the 8th time, and I was like, I just loved her for so many reasons. Her attitude, her spirit, her, the can-do drive. She ended up being president of 3 different clubs when she was here. She's got a great job now. Was she at the top of her class? No. I think she was perpetually sick being the president of 3 clubs and trying to get through the core. And, she's not on the dean's list, but she is somebody who just really made her mark at Columbia. And so, I'm so glad we admitted her. I'm so glad we saw all these wonderful things about her. And I'm not suggesting people should take it 8 times, but this was something that was reflective of her character, strength of character, spirit. And, she got a 500. It didn't mean business school was not a good fit for her. It was a great fit.
Awesome. Any thoughts there, JR?
Well, and I mean, just like Amanda said, I think you're always going to meet candidates that can't prove themselves maybe in some traditional ways, but that's where getting to know admission staff members is very helpful. We're going to look at your resume. We're going to have conversations with you about career goals. You can provide other things that you've done. I've had a lot of people that maybe, because I know we're talking mostly about GMAT as well, but maybe they also didn't do well in undergrad. A lot of times it's usually because of maturity reasons at that point. But they've shown, okay, well, I have taken these 3 classes recently. I took an accounting class, I took a finance class, I took all these other things, and they're showing, one, their work ethic. They're showing how they were able to be successful in the environment that we're putting them in. It doesn't always work out for these candidates, but there's times where sometimes it works out that year. Sometimes we work with candidates for multiple years, because it's a goal, and they show their character and work ethic, and you just, like I said, you just fall in love with these candidates and know no matter what they're going to try to achieve, they are going to be successful. So you want to continue to work with them. But again, I mean, when you look at, as we said before, the 80% range, it's not going to be a huge percentage of the class that falls in this category that can maybe overcome these things. But it's for these types of reasons, getting to know people, understanding their character, their work ethic, all these other things that can lead you into saying, we're going to take a chance, and we think that you're going to do well, so we want to do this with you.
Great advice. Well, we have a few questions. Any other thoughts there on advice for those who are having trouble with their GMAT scores? Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, so I have 2 pieces of advice. One, just for anyone in general, which is the earlier you can try to take the test, do it. It's valid for 5 years. The GMAT is valid for 5 years. You can take it in undergrad and kind of get it done. I think that's a really smart thing to do. The other thing is, plan to take the test more than once. For some people, being in a testing type of a setting can be a really scary or intimidating prospect. And so, you know what, if it doesn't work the first time, no big deal. I remember the first time that I took the GMAT, I went in and they said, okay, put your right palm on the scanner, and you could see which hand I put on. It was not my right hand. And I looked and I was like, this is the way today is going to go. Like, okay, I should probably just turn around and walk out right now. I didn't, but then I planned to take the test more than once, and it was just fine. So practice, be prepared, and try as much as possible. And I know it's hard not to put so much pressure on yourself, because you don't want to be your own worst enemy when you're taking this test. But the more you know that, like, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to take it once, twice, 3 times, that's great. Absolutely great. And so, yeah, just go ahead and keep trying, and within reason, of course.
And I like to echo your
point, put it to bed.
I think, yes. I think the gist of what you're saying is to use the exam as a tool. We often meet people and they're looking at the GMAT as this barrier to entry. It's like, it's the thing that's going to keep me out. I have everything together except the GMAT exam. And if you could try and shift your perspective to think of the exam more as an opportunity or a tool to get you where you're looking to go. As JR talked about earlier, there aren't many other areas of your application you can't impact. You know, it's done. It is what it is. But this is one aspect that, as you've heard, all is not lost if you can't get the score you're looking for. However, you can understand what's being tested on the exam, understand how you learn information, and use that to use the exam as a tool to help you gain entry, to help you stand out, to help propel you. So if you think about it that way, you might already say, hey, I'm probably going to take this. I could take this 2 or 3 times, because you're thinking about it like a tool as opposed to, oh gosh, here we go. You know, so just trying little small things may help. Eileen was on the session last year. One of the things that she said was to, when you're going to take the exam, simulating the test center conditions, like simulating what you're gonna experience there, whether that is knowing what to expect on the day, like silence, practicing in silence, or sitting upright at a computer versus chilling on the couch. So these things can help. Also having a really good understanding of what those question types are, but and she can chime in there, but I always remember that nugget, and I make sure to share it with everyone. So,
well, and I think, and you said that beautifully, but in addition, you know, I think people have the capabilities of scoring like within a certain range, and it depends on which you bring to the test on any given day and kind of what questions you're going to get. So hopefully you bring the best you and you get the best questions for you, and it all works out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to jump to some of the questions that we have. We have a few about GMAT prep. I'll quickly address those. And if you're looking for a diagnostic exam or prep exam, you can go to mba.com/store, and there you'll be able to download our free GMAT prep software. There you'll receive 2 full and practice exams that will also include study questions. Those exams will be scored, they'll be timed, and it'll also give you a diagnostic report so that you can understand the percentages you got right versus wrong on the question types, on the individual sections. So that can really help you get a jump start and get a baseline of where you are, because it's going to use the same scoring algorithm as the exam. So that's one note there.
As a user of that, very helpful. They were great, so thank you.
Yeah. And I want to also jump in, Fanae, because you mentioned about the simulating the test experience. Even with the GMAT prep, it even shows you the exact same colors and everything that you'll see on test day. So knowing what the screen is going to look like, knowing how to navigate through each of the screens and so forth, it's best to use the GMAT prep to start that.
Absolutely. I got some questions for you, Eileen, while I have you up here. And I will like to anchor this. We can't, of course, we're not going to give you the scoring algorithm or anything like that. So we're just setting expectations. We'll answer what we can answer here. What is the main reason behind, if you can answer this, Eileen, someone's asking, what are the main reasons behind not getting high marks on the GMAT apart from lack of study?
So there's a lot of, this goes to the heart of, why we're testing using the GMAT exam and so forth. We say that the GMAT tests abilities that you have, that you've acquired over a long period of time. So when we say acquired over a long period of time, this includes everything that you've learned up through, the content of, say, high school and college and so forth, as well as your reasoning ability. And so it's measuring a couple different things. It's measuring content. So, there are some questions that may ask for calculation of perimeter and something like that. So that's a content question, but it's going to go a little bit further from just the content. The content is the kind of the background. What we're really testing is your ability to shift that, to take it in a different direction. And that's why we call the section, we don't just call it quant, we always say quant, but it's actually not quant, it's quantitative reasoning. So quantitative is the background, and the reasoning is the part that we're really interested in. And because that's what you do in business school, you take the information that you have, the information that you've acquired over a long period of time, and then you twist it so that you get to where you need to be to achieve your goals and so forth. So it's the reasoning part that's harder to study. The content you can study, but it is content that you've acquired over a long period of time. So it is really hard to just study that. But the reasoning is that we're trying to measure with the GMAT exam, not just that you have the background knowledge, but that you can use that knowledge in a way so that, for instance, in the integrated reasoning section, so that you can use the things that are in front of you to combine in different ways to make sure that you're getting to the goal that you need to achieve. And so, that's all very ethereal, if you will. It's not really concrete, and I don't know how well it answers the question, but it speaks to our intention in putting together the GMAT exam and the way that we approach the questions and so forth. And so that, those are some of the reasons. It's that it's not just about knowing your sentence correction, knowing how to find the main idea of a passage and so forth. There's also that component that says, okay, now that I know how to do that, where do I go from there? And I don't know how helpful that answer is, but it's really theoretical. So really hard to pinpoint.
Okay. We have a question about the total score. Now I know we can't provide the score algorithm or anything like that, but is there a general way to explain how the GMAT combines the two scores into a single score? So the question is, how do you combine the two percentages or scores, quant and verbal, and come up with one score?
So I'm going to address that in two ways, and that is the percentiles are not equivalent to the scores. So you can't combine percentages. You can't take the average of the verbal and quant and come up with what the total percentage is going to be. And then the other part is that the way that the scores, and again, the way that the scores are combined, it is a sum of the verbal and quant, but it's a sum that's like 3 steps back before you get to that total score. So the sum of the 2 section scores comes before it's put on the scales, which is why it's not a simple. It's not a simple. You get a 40 on this section and a 35 on this section. You'll always get this total score. And so that's the best way I can think of to explain it. Is that the adding the 2 sections together comes 2 steps back, and because I can't explain what those 2 steps are, then I can't ever guarantee that somebody that gets these 2 scores will get a certain total score.
So the answer is we can't. I got a question.
I want to piggyback on what the admissions professional said, and that is each of the sections matters separately. So, while the total score is important, you should also be paying attention to each of the individual scores and making sure that you get the best possible score on those.
Awesome. Let's talk to Amanda and JR. Should I look at the scores, then choose colleges, or choose colleges and shoot for their scores?
I mean, that's the chicken and egg question. I think, again, and I'll steal Amanda's word here, it depends, because it depends on all of your different personal variables. For example, someone may want to be in a specific region of the country or the world, and that may be more important to them than just going to maybe the top ranked school or et cetera. So, but I do think that it really doesn't matter overall, because whichever one you do first, you should understand where you fall in those targeted schools ranges. And everyone maybe should have a couple stretch goals. Maybe you have a best fit school. There's not a right way to do it. But unfortunately, if you have a dream school and you're well out of their 80% range, either you need to really study and kind of hunker down and figure out, can you get into the range, or you need to readjust what schools you're looking at.
And in addition, when you do campus visits, you had already mentioned, JR, building relationships with people on the admissions teams. I mean, that's another really good way to go about letting people know who you are And I mean this in like, you know, the most positive and constructive way. It's like the person that I mentioned before who 490, 490, 490, 490, and then finally got the 500. And we were thrilled because we met her so many times, met a number of people on the admissions team. And so people are not just a score. There's a lot more to an application than just a score.
Do you look at the previous score? For instance, at the first attempt, it was a 590, and then the last one was a 740. How do you look at this situation?
We look at the top score.
Same here.
Top score. So just be concerned about the top score and we'll be good. Let's see what other questions we have here. For a person who hasn't started with any preparation, are there any tips on what to do first or how long it takes to prepare on average? You can start with that free GMAT prep software. It'll give you a great understanding of your baseline and where you are. It will also give you the diagnostic report, and that's usually a nice place to build from. There you can determine what you need to do, what skills you need to focus on. Maybe you need to shore up some skills and come back to practicing. So that would be my best advice. Anyone else have anything to offer there?
Give yourself ample time to prepare. You don't need the added pressure of time constraints. So whether it's 6 months or 3 months, I mean, people probably have a general idea of roughly how long it's going to take them to study so that they'll do the best that they possibly can on the GMAT. And again, build in time to be able to take the test more than once. If it doesn't go your way the first time, we already said before, try again, and that's great. So make sure that you give yourself enough time to prepare and also know yourself. And when do you study best? How do you study best? I know by the end of the day, I am just totally burnt. And when I was studying, I'm much better in the morning. And so it was like between 5 and 7 every morning. That's when I was studying because I knew myself. And that's when I would be the most focused and not studying when I was tired after having put in a long day at work. It just wasn't going to work out well. So know yourself in that regard too.
Right. I'll add there, if you look at stats, we have a question about, do we have any stats? So when you look at self-reported information from test takers, the majority of test takers, they spend 4 to 6 weeks. And those who score 700 or above, on average, they have spent 80 total hours preparing for the exam. Now, going back to what Amanda is saying, though, I would say the most important part in all of this is really understanding yourself and understanding what you need and how you reason, when you're getting tripped up on certain answers, following your mind map, like how you're arriving there. But going back to the preparation, knowing that those are just averages. You might need 8 weeks. You might need 10 weeks. It's really going to depend on you. And so the only way to know that is to dig into the information. So gain access to it, use the study materials, and understand what's being tested so that you know how much time you need. And really approach it like you're going to approach your program. Amanda studies every morning, so it's really like when you're in your programs, you're not going to be able to just show up at class and do it sometimes when you feel like it. You really have to be disciplined and have a plan. And so approach your GMAT preparation in very much the same way. I think, let me look at this here. We may have answered all of our questions. Any other questions? We have a few more minutes here. I don't see any more popping up. Thank you all so much. This was awesome. I learned a lot today. I hope all of you viewers, you learned a lot as well. Like I said, go to mba.com/surveys if you want to fill out our monthly survey for an opportunity to win a $50 exam voucher. Looking for questions. I don't see any questions, so I think we might be ready to sign off. Eileen, JR, Amanda, thank you so much for joining us, providing some insight on the score. and best of luck to all of you out there.
Thanks,
Have a
Renee.
great day.
Bye.
Thank you, Renee. Appreciate it.